Following the death of George Floyd, protests have rocked the country. We're sitting down with both activists and police officers to discuss a path forward. That's today on Nevada Week.
Support for Nevada Week is provided by Senator William H. Hernstat, Cashman Equipment, and additional supporting sponsors.
From Minneapolis to Las Vegas, anger against police brutality has brought hundreds of thousands of protesters in city streets. Here in Southern Nevada, peaceful protests have turned into violent clashes. Both protesters and police have suffered injuries, including an officer shot and an armed protester killed by police. On this Nevada Week, we are exploring the history of police brutality and racial injustice and related protests in Southern Nevada. Plus, we are giving both activists and officers a seat at the table to discuss the best path forward. Joining us for this discussion is Jageda Chambers, fellow of the Mass Liberation Project, Deputy Chief Andrew Walsh of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, and Clay T. White, Director of the Oral History Research Center at UNLV Libraries. Well, thank you so much for being here at this very difficult time here in Nevada and throughout the nation. The purpose of Nevada Week, I want to state this really quickly, is we examine current events and how those current events are going to affect and drive the future of Nevada. And that's exactly what we want to do on this show when we're talking about this issue. In maybe recent memory, we have not seen the scope of the protests that we are seeing because of the tragedy of George Floyd. And I want to start with that. Jageda, I want to start with you. So how hopeful are you? What are the hopeful outcomes of the protests here?
First and foremost, thank you so much for opening this space and having me. It's a challenging answer there. You know, I'm realistic about protests and the reality, so my mindset going in was safety, like hopefully everybody that chooses to be involved can remain safe. And then secondly, the reality that we witnessed in Minnesota, it has happened here quite a few times. And as you mentioned in your forefront, it hasn't garnered even the interest, I would say. So I think it's an opportunity here locally for those who find themselves moved by the situation in which we all witnessed to dive into locally to see the realities that we have also with our law enforcement and our community here.
Clay T., I want to ask you the same question here. Fundamentally, what's a hopeful outcome we can get out of the protests that we're seeing right now?
So for me, the hopeful outcomes from the protest would be widespread equality. Overall equality. We have people protesting in the Netherlands, in Cape Town, South Africa, about the brutality in the United States of America. That's ridiculous. So I expect broad remedies for racism and for white supremacy, that it will end. I have a whole list of things that I'd love to see come out of this. But when we look at this historically, and when we look at Trayvon Cole, and I think this is the person that you were referring to, it's been a decade ago. And what came out of that, we had some good that came out of that. The Las Vegas Police Department brought in the United States Department of Justice and looked at their policies when it came to using force. And those policies began to change.
Beyond the law enforcement piece of this, of course, protests are way more widespread, reaching the public. Fundamentally, what would you like to see maybe the public is gathering from this? Is it just being able to listen better or understand what exactly is at the heart of this issue?
I think that we have prayed and listened long enough. I think action is necessary. And I think that action means that we have to have better banking policies. So Black communities, because of redlining, never had the kind of economic wherewithal, economic power to have their communities look like all other communities. That has to change. We need to end the kindergarten to prison pipeline. It means that Black boys and girls who are larger than other kids in the classroom are targeted from day one. That has to end.
So fundamentally, if I'm hearing you correctly, that's what the protests are bringing about.
That's what,
fundamental racist
and there are 5 or 6 other items like that on the agenda that we have to face.
Deputy Chief Walsh, I want to come back to the protests again and ask you the same question about hopeful outcomes here. Obviously, Metro is top priority is keeping protesters safe, but you're also the focus of a lot of these protests as well. So trying to show solidarity and yet also trying to protect is a challenging balance here. What are some hopeful outcomes for these protests for Metro?
Well, I think what's already been pointed out is that we are a police department that, with our faults and with the things, with our history, but also we are a police department that has been open to change and open to dialogue with the community. The Department of Justice reforms that were spoken about, that included a cross-section of the community that came about with reforms that we instituted. Every one that applied to the police department were adopted and we changed. But protests, I think in general, what the hopeful outcome is that there's still more change that's needed. There's still more growth and development that's needed from law enforcement, not just locally, but across the globe. And protests, when done peacefully, whether they're out on the street or when the protests on the street end, the dialogue that continues afterwards, they create awareness to issues that law enforcement needs to be cognizant of that still exist in our country. And we need to always work to make sure that we're changing and evolving. And when we find out things that we know we need to do from the community, where training is lacking or where policies are lacking, we need to have the courage to make those changes. And that's what I think a short-term hopeful outcome of this is, that there's more change that comes about for the profession of law enforcement.
Let's talk a little bit about the protests themselves. Not all, but some of the protests have gone from very peaceful occasions to showing some violence here. Do we have, we know why or what is causing that?
Well, it's an interesting dynamic. We've seen protests here locally for as long as I can remember. There's been demonstrations and protests, and for the most part, they've always been peaceful. The interesting dynamic in these events recently have been that they've started out very peacefully. The organizers, in many cases, have met with us at the start of the event. We explain why we're there, and then as the event grows or continues, it seems that we have agitators and folks joining those crowds. So you have otherwise peaceful folks that are there for a good cause, that those crowds then become violent towards as the time goes on. So that's what really causes us an incredible amount of concern, because when bottles and rocks and Molotov cocktails and fireworks and things like that are thrown, bricks are thrown from the crowd, the potential to injure people in the crowd, the injuries to police officers, the property damage, and the things that we've seen, it's not like what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, Jageda, let's talk a little bit about, you've been involved in some of these protests here. First off, have you been able to identify, or your colleagues identifying, who are the agitators that are developing this? First off.
I really feel it's dual faceted. Outside agitators are a part of protesting now, especially in this country, in this climate. And to be brutally honest, Las Vegas has been no different. I know there was a report about a federal indictment that was placed against 3 gentlemen who were arrested before Saturday's protest, and we know their intentions, we know what they're associated with. So when you add that to the mix, I think it's been volatile. The protest that I was first-handly involved with, it was really lifting up the voices of the families who have been impacted by officer-involved killings here locally. And during that, obviously, emotional setting, in a matter of moments, law enforcement had set up. Surely the appearance of law enforcement makes you unsettling, but then when you see law enforcement show up war ready, I mean, you can literally feel the energy swing. People no longer, those mothers were gone, they were irrelevant, and that energy swung down there, and the gap between law enforcement and the crowd, it just shrunk by the second.
Clay T, can you give us some perspective, historical perspective here? As you mentioned, when we talked about generally, the protests aren't new to Las Vegas and Southern Nevada, especially racial protests for injustices and inequalities. Is this common? This potentially lack of trust and how communication isn't maybe happening in protests sometimes because of law enforcement?
Well, so I think it's more than law enforcement this time. Number one, I think it has to do with the way law enforcement is armed now by the Department of Justice or Department of Defense, whomever. The Pentagon had all of this equipment, and they sent it all over the country, that police departments now can look just like someone in military with all these tanks and everything. It's frightening. But prior to this, we had all of those agitators and instigators all along. So the Watts riots back in the 1960s, we saw some of the same thing. But this time we even have something more dire. We have an administration in the White House that condones this kind of behavior, this kind of racism, this kind of white supremacy, and this kind of violence. It comes directly from the people's house. So now we have all of this in the bowl being agitated, and we have permission from the highest place in the land. So this time it's completely different. So people are tired of it now.
Deputy Chief Walsh, let's go back to the protest aspect of what we're talking about here, and let's talk about the delicate balance that law enforcement is faced with here, with making sure you're managing the safety of a crowd, but yet also showing solidarity, what we're talking about a lot right here, and being able to show both of those things together. How are you employing that?
Well, in the conversations I've had with folks at protests or in phone calls with community leaders, first and foremost, it's important to acknowledge that, what's occurred was wrong. And what happened in Minneapolis was wrong. There's other adjectives that we can use to describe it, but it's simply that. It wasn't to the standard or the expectation of our organization, and clearly it's behavior that cost the man his life. So now when you have the demonstrations and the protests, you have a group that of moms that come out and speak, and some that I've even had conversations with over the years, but they come out and they have a voice, and then they see us and we change the complexion of an event like that. But we're there because we know we have a threat to those folks as well. So balancing that, it's not an easy thing, and there probably is no perfect answer to that. Do we not show up and then have those folks get attacked by people that have a different agenda than to just peacefully speak about their experiences? So, I don't know that there's a perfect answer to that.
Well, let's continue that dialogue, and let's talk more about local law enforcement policy here. It's something we've already talked about a little bit. Claytia, as you mentioned, in 2011, there were some significant policy changes. Deputy Chief Walsh, you've mentioned that as well. Jigeda, I wanted to talk to you about some top-of-mind policy here you think that could really change how policing is being done locally here.
Locally, for instance, last legislative session, I want to say it was Senate Bill 242, it extended further protections for officers who may come under these scenarios. Our reality from Las Vegas, I feel like we are light years away from where we need to be, because we have a Tashi Brown scenario where there was an officer who was not fired, okay? Who a grand jury, our district attorney's office chose to surrender that responsibility to a grand jury. I don't know how, if any, officers who have ever been prosecuted for murder, for heinous acts during their time on the force. So we have legislation last year that just passed to give them further protections. So I'm realistic about step one. We have to undo some of the protections that are in order now.
Deputy Chief Walsh, can we get a response from you and talk more about the consequences of potential misconduct here of law enforcement, since that's what we're talking about?
Yeah, and what we're discussing is accurate. Changes that are made at the state legislature, which I'm sure now there'll be additional conversation going forward. I've seen some stuff on the national level where they're calling for special legislative sessions to change rules and laws, but yeah, the protections and extensions that have been mentioned, that's accurate. That's what came out of our last legislative session. And as a leader within policing, I have to abide by what those guidelines are. So it doesn't help leadership or management in any police department when there are changes that are made that add to those protections when we want to conduct an investigation or, inquire into an officer's behavior. Tashi Brown is another one of those cases where very frustrating case, tragic in the loss of life, obviously, but from a follow-up part of that, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department arrested the officer that was involved with that. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department submitted criminal charges on that officer. We don't present the case to the grand jury. We don't have control over what a grand jury decides. When we arrested and charged our own officer, that should send a message to the community that we will do that. The end result of the grand jury obviously was not what the community expected or wanted. If we didn't think it was a criminal act, we wouldn't have arrested and charged them.
What do you see as top of mind here? What are some changes that can be enacted, you think, that can really lead to some of the reform here?
Well, I think we have to, it was, as we've said earlier, it's, there's been a lot of reform and a lot of changes that have come about. I think the Department of Justice, when they came in and looked at us and examined us in partnership with the community, there were almost 80 recommendations, and every one of those has been implemented. I think that where we have also made changes since then, we've implemented training on bias recognition and fair and impartial policing. That needs to continue. Those things need to continue to grow. Those programs need to continue to touch all of our officers repeatedly, and we've expanded that even to our civilian employees as well, so they understand and recognize their own biases and making sure that they don't make decisions based on a bias. And I think although we have a very strong relationship with the community, we need to continue to expand those relationships and bring more people to the table, because it's not my police department, it's the community's police department. And we need to be reflective of the community's voice in our actions. If we can do anything, today, what we need to do a better job of is encouraging and finding more people from minority communities to come and join the police department. Our demographics, we're not reflective of the community we police. And there's a variety of reasons why we have trouble recruiting in the communities that we serve. But that's one area right off the bat that I think if we can change that and start to change the demographics of the police department a little bit, we'll be more reflective of the community we serve, which then internally we have more of a voice.
I'm not here to beat up the police department. It's so much deeper than that.
Yeah.
We're talking about 400 years of racism and white supremacy.
Systemic.
This is more than just police departments.
Yep. And here's one thing I think, we agree. Mm-hmm. I think policing in general, I think I've seen enough videos of police leaders across the country kneeling and doing things at protests.
Yes.
And I don't know those men to tell you that,
Right.
because I know that I've heard from some folks that think that that's actually, they think it's just a ploy.
Counterproductive.
They think it's disingenuous. And I don't know. I don't know those men to tell you one way or the other. But
it did my heart good.
Yeah, it is. Listen, and if it is, even if it's disingenuous, it's still a step. If that's how we get people there,
right.
That's a start.
If my 10-year-old can see that, I don't have a 10-year-old, but if they can see that, that's wonderful. I want them to have that image.
I don't want anybody's children to grow up fearful of the police.
What about joining, like the gentleman that committed the crime in Minnesota, he was a 19-year vet. 2 of the other officers didn't have 3 years combined. So when it's embedded, it's kind of embedded. If you had 2 new rookie cops that are with a seasoned vet that's showing you the wrong way, it is what it is. So I'm leery about even changing police forces. Do I want my son joining the police force? That's what my lens, that's how I look at it through.
Yeah.
You think, buddy, you can change the actions that have been embedded in this systemic racism? good luck to you. We gotta dig a little deeper,
Yeah.
and it's not. Law enforcement is one finger on the fist.
And
I agree.
Andrew, I was wondering, I heard Chief Lombardo talk about this specifically of just the systems that have been employed internally to where you do have the bad apple police officers, that they're identified rather quickly.
And I think that the bad apple thing has gotten really old for the community to hear because, you know, you have more history than I do, but you know, I'm old enough in this profession to remember Rodney King with a few bad apples, right? I think that we have to recognize that might be true. I mean, I think for the most part, I think people agree that police officers, you know, we see enough of the heroic stories to know that they do good work and they do the right thing. But we do have those issues. So a great question, because there was a story that was sent to me last night from a friend of mine that in Fort Lauderdale, there was an officer that at a protest, he's getting screamed at, and he turns to walk away, and there's a protester. If you haven't seen the video, you need to see it. There's a protester sitting on the ground, and she's got her hands up. And this officer turns, and as he's walking away from the person screaming at them, he walks towards the protester sitting, and he knocks her down.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you see that one?
Yes.
So it came out this morning that when they did, or yesterday, he's got 79 use of force incidents in 3.5 years. Now, I know what that means for us. I know what we count as a use of force incident. I don't know if they count a handcuffing as a use of force. I don't know how they calculate that.
That's a lot.
But there's no way to couch it, right? That's a lot of use of force, and so yeah, that wouldn't happen here. But I can't argue with what your life experience is. I don't even want to. I want to know, how do we make it better, and that's why this is important.
I think there are police departments that are cleaning themselves up. Montgomery, Alabama is a wonderful police department because they listen to their community. They have people come in from the 1960s, the civil rights movement, and they listen to them.
Look at Camden, New Jersey, another one.
So we know
They closed their whole police department.
Yeah.
They closed it and then rebuilt it.
I got a baby, because it's hard. I'm such a rated R realist. The hope, it's hard. But I guess Ferguson just elected a black mayor.
Yes, female.
A black female. First
Black female.
It gave me some
Hope.
And that's
my
why I
son
mentioned,
saw
Because
it
black
kinda
women are not scared.
in a fight, and
Yeah.
just for that to happen, it definitely ignited that community. That would not have happened without what they went through. So 6 years, it definitely, and I'm going to reach out to her specifically because it touched my soul. So
Good.
Locally, how optimistic are you that some of these changes can take place? Let's talk about the justice system specifically here. Of course, we have an attorney general that is
I'm very optimistic.
laser focused on this right now.
I'm very optimistic because there are banks like Wells Fargo and Barclay Bank who are beginning to talk about redlining. They didn't even know what it was.
say that.
Yeah.
So they don't even know that when I go in to get a loan, my interest rate, more than likely, with the same credit score, same level of education, my interest rate is going to be higher
I didn't know
than
that.
Yes.
I've lived with this all my life.
And I wouldn't know that.
Right,
It's not.
right.
It's
You have
not.
no reason
And
to have to know
guess,
this.
Guess the percentage of protesters that know that. But there is dialogue that could possibly, chew at this thing a little bit, baby steps, and we have to be optimistic for the hope of that, but realistic in our path towards it.
I'm from Staten Island.
Okay.
So I was a New York City police officer for 6 years before I came here. So just saying Staten Island and New York City police officer, right? Eric Garner is what usually comes out in people's thoughts, right?
Yeah,
so I think when you look at that, I think the conversation for police officers always changes just enough when you say, because you hear folks, and we heard the experts justify what happened to Eric Garner, right? You heard that, you hear both sides of the argument, but you hear people that actually, and I think that's what happened at the grand jury, somebody justified what happened to Tasha Brown, right? So someone talked about how that could be reasonable or objectively reasonable, which separate argument. But I think when you tell officers, hey, what if that was your family member?
Exactly.
And then you see, and every time I do it, I see that pause.
It resonates a little bit,
I see that pause, If Eric Garner was my uncle, would I be happy with the way the police treated with him? No. And I think that
George Floyd.
you can't say it.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. We thank you so much for your time.
It's not
Thank
enough
you.
time.
Thank you.
Not enough time.
Thank you for joining us this week on Nevada Week. For any of the resources discussed on today's show, please visit our website at vegaspbs.org/Nevada-week. You can also find us on social media at Nevada Week.
COVID-19 can be deadly, and the virus isn't going anywhere soon. The CDC recommends wearing a face mask to help limit its spread, especially in crowded public spaces. Anytime you gather outside the home, please wear a mask. Let's do it to protect ourselves, the economy, and our most vulnerable citizens. As a Nevadan, consider wearing a mask a badge of honor and our battle-born duty. Thank you, and let's stay safe, Nevada.